Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Circle of Fellows, episode number 79, I believe. We were just taking a look, and it was July 2015 when we started doing Circle of Fellows. And going to be talking today about stakeholder engagement and achieving effective results through strategic communication. And very happy to have a great panel of fellows to help out with this conversation today. There may be three of you, there may be four. We'll see. But I'm Shel Holtz, IABC fellow. I'm also senior director of communications at Webcor. We're a commercial builder in California, headquartered in San Francisco. And with me right now, start clockwise as I see you with Brad.
Good day, everyone, and glad you could join us for this discussion. My name is Brad Whitworth. I'm coming to you from Northern California's wine country, Sonoma County. I have been an IABC member for what seems like forever, have been in just about every seat in Gold Quill and chair and ethics committee, and love to have these discussions. I am currently doing a lot of consulting work after having worked for a number of high-tech companies in internal and external communication.
George, you're up next.
Hi, everybody. I'm George McGrath. I'm the principal of my own communications consulting firm, McGrath Business Communications, based in New York. Like Brad, a longtime IABC member and volunteer within the organization. Not quite forever as he's been, but pretty close. And it's great to be here with you all today to talk about a subject near and dear to our hearts, strategic communication.
Great to have you with us, George. Letty.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Leticia Narvaez. I'm based in Mexico City. And I also have been participating with IABC for, 30 years or something like that. Representing Latin America and the board and different other positions. And I have my own consultant firm in Mexico City, providing services on organizational communication, strategic communication, social responsibility, and a lot of training on communication and leadership. I'm very happy to be here.
Great to have you with us, Letty. And back with us just in the nick of time is Martha.
Thank you, Shel. So happy to be here in more ways than one. It's always good to troubleshoot, and I guess that's a skill we all communicators have. You got to problem solve on the fly. I live in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, at the far east of Canada, and my practice is with nonprofits, corporations. I look at reputation management, stakeholder engagement, and I also develop strategic plans and do research.
Great. We'll jump into our discussion in just a second, but first I want to let everyone know who's watching in real time that we welcome your questions, your comments, experiences, and observations. You're watching over YouTube Live, and there is a chat feature, and all you have to do is enter your question or your comment right there, and I'm able to display that on the screen so the panelists can see it, and we'll be happy to talk about what you want us to talk about. But in the meantime, there are plenty of questions that we can tackle here. And it probably makes sense to start with some definitions. I mean, we have two words bundled together here, stakeholder engagement. Taken together, we can make some assumptions about what that means, but we should probably unpack that a little, starting with what do we mean by a stakeholder? And is a stakeholder necessarily someone in an audience that we're communicating to? Anybody want to start off with how we're defining this particular term?
Well, let me at least answer the question, communicating to. I think there's also communicating with, because I think in some ways I'm a little bit spooked by some of the concepts of old models of the one-way, top-down, inside to outside communications that we've sort of grown up with initially. And one of the nice things about the idea of stakeholders not necessarily being audiences is that it implies an audience often to me is passive. And with stakeholders, you can certainly have passive groups of stakeholders who don't have to do anything, but you can also have some who are actively involved. It's a little bit more of a dialogue than a monologue, and they're not necessarily just on the receiving end of things. So I applaud the term stakeholder as opposed to audience.
I think it's really useful to look at the origin of the term stakeholder, which meant a person who had a claim. And in most cases, it was a piece of land. So it was an investment, a commitment, a recognition of ownership and involvement. And so when we talk about stakeholders in the groups that I work with, I ask, do you distinguish between an audience who's going to passively receive information, or do you wish to work with stakeholders who have an active interest in investment in the outcome or the purpose and mandate of your organization and what you're trying to achieve? And that really changes the conversation from just information to action, and then recognizing the stakeholder as a partner. Not necessarily an equal partner in all cases, but definitely someone who has an investment in the outcome.
I would add, I think that's great. I would add to that a lot of focus on stakeholders as it relates to shareholders. And I think, we've seen a lot certainly reported in recent years about so-called stakeholder capitalism, and the idea that businesses should be looking at other constituencies in addition to shareholders and other priorities in addition to financial results in defining what success means. So that's another dimension of this that I'm always interested in exploring.
Yes, and I also would add the term, the importance of listening. When we communicate, an important element of communication is listening. So when we know that our audiences are listening, so they become stakeholders because they react to that listening. They are listening, we are listening to them, and they react to that. So they are claiming something, they participate, they are proactive. So that would be also a difference.
Yeah, George, when you talked about looking beyond the shareholder, I know that the Business Roundtable, I think it was the year before last at this point, said that they were no longer going to be focused just on shareholders, but on a broader range of stakeholders. So we're not talking about people who necessarily have an ownership stake in the organization, but some other interest. Some of the groups that might include would be people who live in the communities where the organization has operations. For example, certainly employees have a stake in the decisions that are made by the organization. Anybody want to throw out some others?
I was just going to say, in general, I think that one of the things that we ask of communications people when they're putting together a program, a plan, is to do audience analysis. And I think something we might even think about is calling it stakeholder analysis, because it really is going through and thinking of all these groups who have anything from a minimal stake in relationship with an organization to those that you really need to have actively engaged, actively committed to, and then I think you sort of will get into what does it mean to be engaged, because it probably varies tremendously from one group to the next what's expected of them. So I think that just coming up with this, okay, how do I go through and analyze all of these, and probably go through some sort of an exercise where you put priorities on them. This is a primary stakeholder group. These are secondary, these are tertiary, a little bit further away from the center of attention.
Yeah, I think stakeholders could be really anybody that any constituency that the organization touches that have an interest in what the organization is doing and how it affects them, or can have an impact from the outside in on our organization and our ability to achieve our business objectives. So, for example, stakeholders can include business partners. It could include government agencies, elected officials. Basically, anybody who sort of can have an impact in our ability to do business or achieve our objectives, or likewise any group that we could have, organization have an impact on for better or worse through our actions.
So we've defined what a stakeholder is. What are we talking? Go ahead,
I
Brad.
was going to say, I would love to build on what George said because I think it's really important. I mean, when you could also sort of say that usually we often think of these as friendlies, people that you want on your team. But the other part is that there are stakeholder groups that are the antagonists. They are sort of the opposite of, and I think that we need to sometimes broaden our definition and figure out ways of including people that don't necessarily want to be included with us.
Activist groups, for example, maybe a hostile media. Examples of that. So what are we talking about when we talk about engagement? And I think one of the reasons this is an interesting word these days is because it is a very widely used word in digital and social media circles. And, engagement is pretty clearly defined when you're talking about social media as clicks, views, shares, comments, things like that. But in the broader world of communication, I think we're going to look for a broader definition or a different definition than simply taking some sort of action with something that has been posted online. What are we talking about when we talk about engagement?
Well, one definition could be referring to our employees. For example, it could be like the employee's willingness to give a discretionary effort to do something else, to go beyond what they normally do or they should be doing, because they feel committed, because they feel they belong, because they really are proud of working for the company. So they give this additional effort to what they do.
Well, I like that, Letty, because it also builds upon I sort of saw this transition from at one point we were doing satisfaction surveys. How happy are you to be working for a certain employer? And engagement goes beyond that. I actually had someone challenge me one time when we talked about a satisfaction survey who said, yeah, I have a warehouse that scored very, very high on satisfaction, but low on productivity. They were happy, but they were also misbehaving, and they weren't pulling their weight. They were probably doing drugs and goodness knows what all else in the back. So I like engagement because it does get to that active participation, something above the sort of minimal what's expected of you aspect. And so I'm glad that it's a little bit more, but I'm not sure that engagement captures it all. Certainly on employees, it's easy to measure. Engagement is different, though, I think, for some of those other stakeholder groups that we've been talking about.
To your point, Brad, I remember reading an article a year or so ago about a hospital worker in Italy who had figured out how to not show up for work for over 25 years and continue to get paid and not get caught. I imagine that was a very, very happy employee. Very satisfied.
But he was not engaged.
Yeah. Not an engaged worker at all.
Well, I like to think of engagement as the connection that you have. So to Brad's point about the warehouse of happy employees, but they weren't productive, well, they might be quite content, but they really weren't connected to their work. They didn't have, they didn't associate meaning or positive outcomes or value to the work that they're doing. So when I talk to people and we're looking at engagement and we're looking at working with different audiences and stakeholders, I often ask, how do you connect? What do you expect to come from that connection, that relationship that you have with the stakeholders? And that starts to get people thinking in different directions in terms of, this is just how we reach people, or this is how they're satisfied and report back to us on that level. So I think these kinds of conversations are really useful, because if we've learned anything, is that we don't always attach the same definition or interpretation to a word depending on the context in which you're operating.
One of the definitions I've appreciated for engagement is all around the metaphor of a vehicle with a stick shift, right? Because when it's in neutral and is not engaged, it is just sitting there. But when you engage the clutch, the car moves. So engagement is what creates movement. was what creates action. So, with those definitions in hand, stakeholder engagement would be trying to create some sort of action, some sort of movement, some sort of change or reinforced behavior or activity from somebody that is important to the organization, that has a stake in the future direction, the performance, the operations of the organization. How do we be strategic about this? And Martha, I think you started to touch on this just a minute ago when you talked about knowing what it is that we want from those groups. We have to start with some sort of vision of the outcome that we're looking for the effort that is designed to produce this engagement.
It's so true. Depending on who you talk to, I mean, we all have encountered those managers, those directors who, say we need a newsletter or we need to have a 5-page spread in a national magazine because competitor X or company Y has done the same. And I encountered this and I remember saying, well, what's the purpose? And they were kind of like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, what do you want to have happen? Because depending on what it is you want to achieve, we're going to package it in a different way or maybe even come up with a completely different approach. And I think, when we talk about strategy, it is about having that vision about what you want to result rather than just saying, here's a product. And we kind of hope that it's going to achieve what we think it's going to achieve and what we want, but they haven't really thought about that outcome. And getting people to be visionary in a concrete way can sometimes be a challenge. And it's also, though, a very exciting creative process because when people know what it is they want to have happen, then they can start to figure out how they're going to get there.
And I so agree with Martha. I think we speak a lot about being strategic, and sometimes we don't have very clearly what does strategic mean. So strategic really mean in communication like directing a systematic plan of action towards a specific intended result. So it entails linking clear objectives to actions evaluated to assess the result. So in strategic communication planning then is the process of driving alignment between the communication function and the organization's core objectives. The communication strategy is the heart of strategic communication planning. And so I believe being strategic is a state of mind. It's about the discipline of taking a step back towards to the noise of considering how communication activities contribute to an organization's desired end state. So I think we need to be very clear and not just focusing on tactics, but first going back, making research of what really is needed, and then developing the strategic plan.
Well, Letty, you're absolutely right, because I think that's one of the downfalls. We're just coming off of, when we're recording the show, the evaluation of gold quill entries in IABC's annual competition evaluation of some of the best communication around the world. And the ones that really stand out are the ones who have been able to tie their communication programs to specific business outcomes. It's not just we did it because it's beautiful and it's out there and we can tick the boxes on the to-do list. It really is something where you can show that you have moved the needle. Moving the needle, though, can be very, very different. We'll probably want to explore some of that. I'm also thinking, I loved your analogy, Shell, of the clutch gets the car going in motion. I'm also trying to figure out what part you need to engage, because sometimes it's the head, sometimes it's the heart, sometimes it's actually the hands doing things, and sometimes it's all three. The other piece is that while we're trying to get people to do something, sometimes it's also the getting them not to do some things. So that whole notion of what is the strategy, what is that we're trying to accomplish, and I think the other piece is that they should be aligned across stakeholder groups, but they're certainly not identical across those groups.
Yeah, I read a fascinating research report by a couple of academics that were looking at the power of narrative, the power of storytelling to influence people. And what they found was that when you were trying to influence legislators around policy as it related to a particular issue, narrative storytelling didn't work. It didn't move the needle at all. So, there are a lot of assumptions that we tend to make when we're looking at engaging an audience that I think need to be tested as part of a strategic process.
Did anything work with politicians?
Yeah, there were things that did.
Okay.
Statements of fact and data showing cause and effect was much more effective than telling the story of one family for this one issue with this one group.
Yeah, I think those are all excellent points, and it kind of goes back to this what we were talking about earlier about stakeholder analysis. And we really need to, in developing these strategic communications plans, we really need to take a look at what are sort of the attitudes, the experience, the questions, and the concerns that each of these stakeholders sort of bring to any situation we're going to be involved with them in. So, for example, if you're working in a community where you have a manufacturing site that you want to expand, there is inevitably a whole history in that community of their sort of relationship with the plant. Things have happened in the past, maybe things that you did wrong in the past that you cleaned up, but people are not as aware of, that sort of color how they relate to your organization or your company right now. And that involves, I think, a lot of discussion with the stakeholder audience that you're dealing with. And in doing that, we always want to remember that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, because we should be spending more time listening to people and less time talking to them, at them.
I also think that you bring up a good point too, George, that we probably need to not assume that all stakeholder groups, because we often generalize and make some assumptions and, these people are aware of the background that we had that happened in, but you've also got people who may be brand new to the community. You also have, and it's not unusual in most parts of the world today to see what one might label as a single group is really bifurcated and has polar opposite opinions about some topics. So to be able to do what you said, which is go in and maybe analyze the attitudes, the background, the history that groups bring, and move away from this assumption that just because someone has a certain label on it belongs to a certain stakeholder group, that they think identically with everybody else who you have put in that same bucket. Because I think we have to go at sort of mass communications and approach, and we can't really get to that point of tailoring messages one for everybody who's involved. However, we have to be aware of there's a bell-shaped curve. People fall in the center, but there are also outliers on any audience that we're dealing with, any stakeholder group.
I think it's important to clarify also the expectations around why you're connecting with the group. And that relates to ownership and decision making. And so often we see communication as, well, here's information that you need so you can go off and make decisions in other places. And sometimes the people you're working with, they see it as, oh, here's information, you want to partner with me, so we're going to make this decision together. And that's not always the case. And sometimes if that conversation isn't had at the start, then you're in for a nasty surprise. I quite like the rubric that's been developed by the International Association for Public Participation in terms of how you engage with people by the kinds of information and decisions that you want to achieve with them. So it goes right from, this is just purely for information, do with it what you will, we think it'll be useful and interesting, but there's no expectation for a response from you back to us, right up to, you're our partners, you have inside expertise, we expect to use that, and you're going to be co-decision makers in this process. And if that expectation is not clarified, if you're trying to present and work with community on environmental impact statements, and the people you work with think, oh, there's going to be some decision making around what happens where, and then it turns out, no, they're just looking for some knowledge so they can tick a box that they have consulted and engaged with a particular community. So I think it's really important to define those expectations and those accountabilities of what's expected also from you as the body sharing, connecting, engaging with the desired stakeholder or audience.
Yeah, I think when it's like goes back to the old saying we have about doing surveys. Don't ask any questions you don't want an answer to, that you have to act on. And I think if we get engaged with stakeholders, whether that's employees or community groups or environmental activists, we have to be willing to listen, and we have to be willing to listen with an eye towards taking action. If we do that, we'll build sort of credibility in a relationship with those stakeholders over time. And if you don't, you're going to sort of rupture a relationship that's going to take a long time to recover.
Well, and everything we've been saying ties back to where we started the discussion also, which was that this is less and less about audience and just the information, although that can be a part of it, as Martha pointed out, but more about the dialogue, the relationship, the two-way sharing of ideas and perhaps direction, as opposed to the relatively passive view that historically communications people have been put in the position of doing. Oh, just get this out there. Just getting it out there is no longer good enough.
Yes, and just building on what George mentioned, I just would like to add that one of the apparent failures of employee engagement efforts is likely due to the way of engagement programs are executed. And one of those is that the overuse of poll surveys to get immediate feedback and rarely take action on the results. So at some point, you don't take actions on that. Why don't you ask? Why do you ask? No.
Let me ask you a question about this whole notion of communication being the function that manages stakeholder engagement. That's not always going to be the case, right? I mean, I think there's a role for communicators to play counseling others in the organization who are accountable for managing a relationship with a stakeholder or stakeholder public.
Well, and I'll start just with the concept that I think engagement, maybe this isn't actually true on the historic side of things, but engagement most often was associated with employees, which gets back to that. We didn't want just satisfied employees. We want them providing that sort of discretionary effort that Letty described so well. And then we've sort of broadened the definition to include other groups with whom we need that relationship. And I think the other piece is the sort of to George's point, the surveys, Letty's, like the over surveying things, it's often easy with employees to ask questions. It's sort of a, if you want to call it a captive stakeholder group, an active one where you expect people to do this and they expect to be asked and they have expectations on what's going to happen. And that's where we get into the over. I think some of the other groups, it's a little bit more difficult to have that kind of, they're not necessarily involved day to day. They certainly don't have to worry about it for their paycheck and the day-to-day expense part of things. But we need to make sure that we sort of take these things and look at them one at a time. And what are we hoping for? And not just necessarily, send out a survey, get the results, and check the box that we've heard what people said, and these are the numbers. And it's how do you translate that into action and circle back with the people who are active participants.
Yes, the concept of reporting back is not always built into an engagement process and saying back to people, this is what we found, this is what we heard, and here's how we think we're going to proceed with the next stage or what have you. I am seeing more of it, and it's presenting itself in different ways. Some of it is quite extensive and some of it is a form of updates, but I am seeing more people recognizing that almost like a spiral as opposed to closing the circle, that now we have this piece of information, so we're going to move to the next level. And it's not necessarily a closure or full stop, although it can happen at a certain point.
Well, to your point, I think, Martha, we also historically communications people have come from the campaign idea. Once we've done it once, we're done. And I think what we need to do to grow up is look at communications more as a long-term process. And that's certainly, we have a snapshot in time that we often start with that was true, but we also need to, instead of saying, oh, we're going to be done as soon as we get things out, recognize that there are new players in the picture, that the environment may change. And to your point, Shel, I think what we can be is those orchestrators who connect the dots, who see all these various relationships, who realize that this group over here might have an impact on what's going on over there. We make sure that we can facilitate the internal conversations to be aware of and maybe help orchestrate what some of those actions should be to be able to get the best possible outcome for all of them.
Do we need to be engaging with all of our stakeholders?
Well, some more than others, I guess, is the answer. Yeah, and that I think depends on your organization's business priorities and what are sort of the biggest issues that the organization has to deal with right now. So, certainly during the whole experience, a lot of the companies we work with COVID was that they had to spend a lot of time prioritizing the employee audience, because that was kind of integral to them being able to continue to operate during COVID, and really understanding what they had to do to get employees in line with sort of new health and safety practices to keep their facilities running and keep serving their customers was the priority. And other stakeholders had to kind of go by the wayside for a little bit. So I think it sort of depends on your immediate priorities, but whether you're working with a particular stakeholder group intensively right now, or putting them aside, I think we always want to take that approach that we engage with them first and foremost to listen, to hear how they're viewing the actions we're contemplating, and see what they can tell us that would help us do a better job.
Yes, I also believe that we need to engage with all our stakeholders, but in different levels. It depends on how, as George mentioned, the priority and the strategic plan, the timeliness, and listening and reacting to that. But definitely, I believe that when we define our stakeholders, it's because we have to engage with them.
And sort of back to your point, Shell, I think the other thing is when you put together one of these sort of all hands on deck kinds of plans and realize that it talks to multiple stakeholder groups, it's probably more than one person departments, which is often what happens in communications, or even a communications team can actively manage solo. I think that's where our ability to be able to influence others in an organization, to be able to align resources, to act as facilitators as opposed to doers, to behave strategically instead of tactically, becomes a really important skill. I think we find that true in most communications early on when we come into an organization and say, hey, you can't do that without checking with communications people. And it's really true when you get to something as complex as a strategic communications program or plan. You're not acting in a vacuum. You can't hope to be able to do all of this stuff yourself. So how can you get everybody on the same page? And I think that's a skill set that communications people need to build as they move through their career. You don't get it on day one with instant credibility and walking through the door. It comes with building trust and building relationships with the other players who can definitely influence the outcomes that you're looking for in the overall plan.
So we've talked about surveys and the downside of relying on them. I agree that internally they can be of use, particularly in organizations where employees know that this is one of the channels through which they're able to amplify their voice, where we share the results with them. And we don't ask questions that we don't want to hear the answers to. We do use surveys only around those things where if we hear something that suggests that we need to change something, that we're willing to explore changing that thing. Outside of employees, absent surveys, how do we know that we've achieved the kind of engagement that we're looking for?
Oh, well, because of their behavior, the way they act as a result of our communication strategy. Client, consumers, government, how they react to the focus that we had in our messaging. I believe that that's a way in which we can learn that they reacted and that they are engaged.
It does come down to what your vision and what you want to have happen. If you are looking to, undertake a restructuring of the organization, and at the end of the day, when you've completed your process, you want your employees to be happy within the new structure, or you want your customers to be happy with the new method of delivery, then you have to figure out at the very start how it is you're going to measure that. If contentment with the new reporting structure or the new organizational structure, are there things like decreased complaints? Are there increased attendance or participation in meetings, and how you track that, numbers of questions? Different initiatives will have different kinds of indicators and outcomes. But too often I have seen where at the very end of an initiative or a campaign or a program of action or change, it's, oh, well, now we got to figure out if we succeeded. We're all very good at being deliverers of information and organizers of events at which such information or products that can share or change or what have you. But we don't spend as much time on the measurement. And so thinking about those indicators is really a more significant question as we go forward in both the virtual and face-to-face environments. How do you gauge? How do you measure? What are the outcomes you're looking for?
I also think that it brings up a really interesting topic too, Martha, that sort of the longer term view of what you're trying to accomplish. And we certainly try to capture that when we put together the plan with the, and we encourage it with SMART goals when we ask people to put things together for entering in communications awards programs. By this time, we need to have gotten this number accomplished and whatever metric. But I also think we need to take that longer term view of the how do we go beyond that first stage. And it's almost like a chess match. Where do you want to be after that and after that and after that? What is the long term goal? And I think for those sorts of efforts, you need to find ways to over time engage some of the stakeholder groups. I'm thinking of things like maybe with a customers, it could be a customer advisory council that's on a regular basis feeding back into your own sales and support organization some of the here's what it is that we wish you were doing for us aspect that can also help you sort of not only do a strategic communications plan, but a strategic direction for the organization and works into the organization's long-term goals. The same thing is probably true on the community side, the legislative side. Again, a lot depends on what business you're in, what these stakeholder groups are, what their needs are, what you hope to accomplish as an organization. And I think that we have proven as a group, the communications world, that we probably need to be a part of all of that. And I think to a large degree, we can help orchestrate it, but maybe it's sort of change management on a massive scale.
Isn't it part of strategic communication, the whole notion that we're being strategic about this, that we would identify the metrics that we will use to assess success in a communication effort before we launch it? That we'll have figured out that this is the needle that has to move, and this is how we're going to assess that it has. I mean, Martha, you're absolutely right. I mean, I can't tell you how many times, and you see this in gold quill entries too. It's clear that the measurement was something that occurred to them when they saw that they had to fill in that part of the form, and they came up with it. But if we're going to be strategic, where the whole idea is that we're doing this to achieve some sort of a measurable result that is meaningful to the organization, then we're going to know how to measure that result before we start.
Yes, of course. Among the best practices for being strategic is setting clear and measurable objectives, drive alignment, set yourself for success, focusing on audiences, see messaging as your core product, and design the tactical mix strategic, and establish the fundamentals So I think if we consider all this and at the end measure, refine, report, you measure, you see if you are reaching your goals, and then maybe you have to refine what you are doing. That's a fundamental part of being strategic.
Well, and I think one point, though, that you make that is that we don't necessarily have to set the goals. I think we need to be sort of cognizant of what it is that I'll call it internal stakeholder groups. Perhaps there's a customer group over here, or maybe there's a support. What are their goals for being being successful? And maybe again, we're the ones who amalgamate all of these disparate goals, and instead of saying here's what the goals for the organization should be, it's like the adding things together to be able to come up with the answer, as opposed to we don't have to make all this stuff up ourselves. We have to do what everybody's been talking about, which is go out and actively listen to what it is that our groups, our stakeholders want to accomplish, and ask them what they would see in terms of some, force them to do the smart goals that usually fall on our shoulders, like Shell points out, after the fact.
When we're doing the stakeholder analysis as part of the strategic planning process, how do you find out what kind of communication is going to provoke the kind of engagement that we're looking for? I'm thinking about a paper that I just read the other day. This was from an organization that deals with, they're a counter-terrorist organization, and they're focused in this paper on addressing violent extremism, and the organizations, both state players, private players, and public-private players that are out there trying to prevent people from becoming violent extremists, or dissuade them from that path after they've started down that path. And what they found was that they were not as effective in their communication when they talked about outcomes. What was effective in the communication was being transparent about the processes that led them to take the approaches that they did. How do we know which kind of approach to take? In this case, how do we know? Because as a communicator, I'm going to immediately go to the outcome. I'm immediately going to go to, let's tell success stories that our approach works, and you should bring your cases to us and not to the other actor here. How do we know what kind of communication is going to be effective with which stakeholder, so that we can craft the right kind of an approach to initiating this engagement in the first place?
I think we ask them, what are the ways that you receive information? Can you tell me about something that particularly resonated with you? I remember a number of years ago working with a group to develop a program to engage young women in pursuing non-traditional trades and education. And I asked them, because we were thinking of doing some audiovisual material. And I said, tell me about, your favorite advertisements. And they all looked at me because they were watching stuff online and they skipped over the ads. So they had no favorite advertisements that they could share with me, right? But what they told me was they talked about being able to see girls like themselves doing the kinds of things that happen as a result of taking these programs. So, we switched our gear in terms of how do we make them feel seen, rather than just saying, here's a commercial. So I think sometimes we just have to ask people, how do you want to receive the information? What is the best approach to use with you? And also to look around. One of the great things about working with IABC is to be able to connect with other communicators and say, we're thinking of doing something like this. What have you learned from your experiences?
I'm reminded a little bit of the time that I was asked to work in Asia Pacific and Latin American markets. And one of the best pieces of counsel that was given to me by a senior leader who'd been doing that for decades was, we need to suspend value judgments. And I think that's one of the things that we as communications people need to remind ourselves all the time, sort of that objectivity, the openness to just because we've done something a certain way and it has been effective there doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be equally effective with this stakeholder group at this time there. So you bring those experiences, you bring the track record of what has worked, but you also come in with an open set of eyes and an open mind to, there may be other ways to go about doing this. And so instead of that cookie cutter, I can get this thing done, watch me, boom, I get it out aspect, I think it's more of that listening that we've talked about doing, the engaging these groups, the asking the probing questions. Instead of seeing the world through our own eyes, we need to be able to see it through our stakeholder group's eyes. And that's a skill set that doesn't come instantly. And I think that the good part is that if we're smart and do what we've been saying all along, which is listen to these stakeholder groups, and then find ways to incorporate it, that's the best thing. And it gets back to you've got opinions and you've got data that you can work with to come up with a program that you can then go off and sell, because you have done the homework that perhaps nobody else has done in tying all these disparate, tremendously varying pieces together.
Yes, I believe it goes back to what we should always be doing, like is researching, trying to investigate and research what are the real needs of our stakeholders. And then according to that, develop our communication. And another element would be, I believe it's quite important, is authenticity. In this global world that we're living now, of course, there's like transparency and everybody knows everything about every company and every person. But however, I think there's a difference on being authentic, and our stakeholders can perceive when we are authentic about what we are communicating and about our actions that are coherent to what we are saying, to what our communication is. And authenticity may also influence a lot the reaction of our stakeholders.
Letty, let's stick with that idea of authenticity for a minute. For some organizations, stakeholder engagement becomes a primary consideration after some sort of crisis, after some sort of breach of trust. How important is authenticity in that engagement to rebuilding a damaged relationship with a stakeholder group?
Well, I believe it's quite important in terms of our employees. Why authenticity boosts our teammates. There was a research made in Germany that in which they found that not only do authentic workers have higher work engagement and lower work exhaustion, but their teammates had the same results regardless of whether they were authentic themselves. So the effect occurs in reverse. Employees with authentic teammates had higher work engagement, even if the employees lacked authenticity themselves. So the results suggest that the benefits of authenticity go beyond the individual and spill over to teammates as well. So we can improve our teammates' work behavior by merely being ourselves and being really acting ourselves with authenticity in every action we have in the company, during the meetings, in the one-on-one communication, to foster that authenticity among the leaders. So when employees really see and perceive that their leaders are authentic, that the company is authentic about what they are communicating, then they react in the same way. And because, as we mentioned before, when we develop surveys, we really don't know the percentage in which there is credibility about what is being answered in those surveys. But when employees really see that we are authentic, they may start reacting and answering in the same way.
I think you bring up a great point, Letty, about that authenticity and knowing the audiences you're working with. I'm reminded a little bit too of the, in our efforts to be inclusive, we go and grab somebody from that group and that group and that group, and we often look to the leaders of organizations to come in, whether they're active or not. I think what we often forget is sort of that whole Malcolm Gladwell tipping point notion of there is a network, a non-formal network that may not have titles, that we need to make sure that's certainly true on the employee side of things. There's, some great research that shows that you can communicate with an entire group of employees, reach 85, 95% of the crowd by communicating with 3% of the employees who are those communication mavens, the ones who somehow get great information coming into them and also find ways to share it within their groups. I think we need to use that same sort of mentality in the outside world of looking at not just somebody who might be a titular head of some sort of one of the stakeholder groups, but really reaching into the grassroots part of things to make sure that we're getting the real message, that authentic message, and the feel from the network of people who are out there, and not just somebody who's posturing and maybe taking a position that is powerful, but not necessarily, to your point, authentic.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Brad. There are informal networks aplenty in organizations. I've seen them defined a number of ways. The simplest I've seen is that there's a communication network. That is, who do you go to find out what's going on? There's a solution network. Who do you go to find out how to accomplish something, how to get around some bureaucracy or through some red tape? And then there's a trust network. Who do I go to find out if I should believe something? And if you map out those networks internally, then you know which network to tap into, and in fact, who to go to start getting the word through that network and to engage those particular people.
And those networks exist outside our organizations as well.
Indeed.
Probably a little bit tougher to tap, again, sort of by yourself. And I think that's one of the things that we need to overcome. Like, it gets back to that whole, are we tacticians? And we'd love to roll up our sleeves. We'd love to be in control. We'd love to be able to put the whole thing together, but we need to learn how to give up control, as if we really ever had it in some instances, and engage others and put people on the same team. So I think part of our role is communications people is to be salespeople and find ways to sort of create this. We're all in this together and figure out who's the team, what is it we're trying to accomplish together, because you're never going to be able to do it all yourself.
I think that's a really useful point, and just to kind of tie back into an idea that came from Letty in terms of authenticity. You know, when we talk about reputation management, we often think about stuff that's external. You know, how do you repair the relationships outside a company because of, you know, some disaster or some collapse, ethically or morally or financially. But we tend not to really work all that hard about how do we repair and what's our reputation inside an organization, and the function of internal communications in terms of building that trust that then leads to the meaningful engagement. And I think those are really useful questions to say, you know, who do we need to talk to? Who else can we speak to? Who are the networks that we have, and who are the networks that our employees have? But how does that flow work inside an organization as well as outside an organization?
I wonder if we might take the last few minutes we have here. And by the way, with less than 7 minutes left, for those of you who are watching live, if you do have questions, now's the time to pose them. But can we share examples of stakeholder engagement that you've been involved with, or that you have seen, maybe judged a Gold Quill Award, that stand out for you? I mean, one that has been top of mind for me for many years, because God knows how long ago I heard this, but it was back when there was a boycott of the tuna canners, the tuna packagers, because of the number of dolphins that were being caught in tuna nets. And StarKist brought the fishermen together, and they found a way to reduce that dolphin catch, and that led the activists to come back out and say, yeah, boycott tuna, but not StarKist, because they're doing the right thing. There was stakeholder engagement with the activist group, with the trade partner being the fishermen, that moved the needle and protected sales at a time when their competitors were being hurt by this. So I thought that was a great example of stakeholder activity, stakeholder engagement. What are some of your favorites?
we did some work a number of years ago with a lot of work with real estate developers and people who are sort of building projects in different communities. And you have to, when you do those things, you have to go through a lot of sort of local permitting process, and there's environmental regulation and review that has to go into that. And the traditional approach is you go into those meetings, you have, all right, well, we have to like check off the box and do this meeting with the community groups. So let's go in with our PowerPoint presentation, and we know we're going to get hammered after it and people will be yelling at us. But the goal is just get through the meeting so we can check it off the list. And we worked with clients on a different approach, which is to say, look, we have to understand where the community is coming from as a starting point. There's a history here before we got here that sort of that will sort of tell us why people have the attitudes and views towards our type of project that they do. We need to go understand what that is going in. And then so that we can then have a discussion and a dialogue with people as opposed to sort of a one-way presentation. And the format then for the meeting we came up with is, as opposed to doing like a stand-up PowerPoint presentation with a Q&A, we basically set up the room with sort of different areas that sort of illustrated different aspects of the project. You know, the environmental impact of it, the economic impact of it, what the project was going to look like when it was done, the impact in terms of jobs, and basically took our subject matter experts from the company and put them in each of those places. And then people basically came into the room, we welcomed them, and it was like an open house. You went around and talked to the different people and really got involved in discussion with them, some of which got quite passionate. But people felt we were listening, and then we reflected that back in modifications we made to the plan, the development plan. So I think creating that kind of atmosphere where you understand what those stakeholders are expecting from you coming in, and then create a real dialogue with them and discussion with them, listen to them, and then play that back in a modification of your plan will build credibility and help you get that project done.
I loved hearing what you just said, George, about that listening, and it was a different form of listening, because sometimes we just like put 4 people up in front of a hostile audience and think that we're listening. And the question also is, are you really hearing? I'm reminded of a situation of a group in South Africa that a communications person told me about, of a lesson learned in terms of stakeholder relations and building a plan. They were working with a township that needed a lot of things. And this group, the client that they were working with, the company that wanted to help impact this place and make it a better township, pulled together some people from inside the company. This is a consumer products group that was very, very active in children. They decided that the best thing that they could do, where they could make a contribution, was helping build a playground that would, be a magnet, a strong point for the kids growing up in the community, something for them to do. And while they developed these great plans and were about to launch it, they ended up talking to people who said, that's really nice. We would appreciate having a playground, but what we really need is basic sanitation. So instead of putting money into this play facility, why don't we work on building an adequate sewer system, because our streets need that first and foremost. So I think those, are you really actively listening? Are you engaging the right people? And are you open to changing your plan if it's not necessarily on target with the true needs of what you're trying to make an impact in doing?
Great. Martha, Letty, if you have one, we've got about 20 seconds for you to share them.
Well, I think it's really important to create those spaces where you can listen to people and also help them create responses in whatever way works for them. We've used community mapping as a really good way to locate where stuff is and how people connect to it. And that can be within an organization or can be in community. It's a really useful tool. And the kinds of information you gain from it are really successful because people become part of that process and then they start to own it. And to me, that's always a sign of a successful engagement, is that when people feel they own part of it and that they're invested in the outcome, to me, that's the single biggest important point that you can take away.
Okay, and I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there because we are out of time. I only have enough time to tell you that coming up in the next episode, episode 80 of Circle of Fellows, will be executive communication and leadership as the topic, with Adrian Cropley and Amanda Hamilton Atwell, Mark Schumann, and Stacy Wilson on the panel. That is scheduled for Thursday, April 21st. It will be at 2 p.m. instead of the usual time that we are doing these at noon, and that is to accommodate Adrian. It will actually be April 22nd for Adrian when we hold this panel, and I hope to see all of you then. Looking forward to that. Thank you all for your participation in this discussion. And until next time, that'll do it for this episode. Bye, all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Sorry, I thought I disconnected that phone. And I would love to